My name is David Herbert Armstrong. I'm married to Stephanie Armstrong. I have a son and a daughter. Quincy is here and with his wife Christy, and they're filming this. My daughter Maggie lives in Sitka, Alaska with her husband and 3 children. And they're not able to be with us this week when I'm celebrating my 80th birthday, which is today. I've been asked to give the history of my grandparents on both my father's side and my mother's side. I'll start with my father's relatives because I know the least about them. My dad was a product of George Armstrong, my paternal grandfather, product of his second marriage, and he was a late-born child. His mother must have been near 50 when he was married, and so I think he was either already dead or he was dying within a year or 2 of my birth. There's some record that he died in 1934. My mother had told me that he and his wife came up to visit me when I was a newborn, but in any event, I never met them, and I know nothing about them except what's in written histories. George Armstrong was an executive in at least one paint company in Portland. I think his family was from Ireland, according to some records that we have reviewed. But anyway, he had a fairly good job, and the family lived well. They had a big home in Portland, and he also during his marriage, 2 marriages, purchased 2 farms, one south of Portland and one east of Portland. He sold the one south of Portland, and my dad's brother George worked the farm that was east of Portland. My dad had 2 half children, and 3 siblings that were full-blooded to him. I don't know what more I can tell you about my dad. We have some records. We have a letter that was, or some sort of a diary that was kept by Alice, one of my dad's sisters. But continuing on then, and with my dad, he was born in Portland and was raised there. He went to college at Corvallis, Oregon State, and I think he did 2 years. And then he got a job, he was a musician, played the piano, and he got a job playing with a band that was going on a ship around the world. They were freighters basically, but they took passengers too. And my dad did that twice. When he got done with that, he didn't go back to college, but he started working in Portland and met my mother a short while after that. I think I'll stop that story now and go to my grandmother's family and kind of lead up to where we are now with this one. My grandfather, Herbert Pointer, after whom I'm named, my middle name, was born in Vancouver, or one of the small areas around Vancouver, Washington. His family lived on a farm. He went to school until the 2nd or 3rd grade, and then he had to start working around the farm and going to other farms and working. He ultimately met my grandmother when he got a job at her father's farm in southern or central Oregon. It was in the Willamette Valley. And he was apparently a wealthy landed guy. My mother talked about him. Her memories of him are that he rode a white horse around the farm and supervised all the hired hands. He owned something like 1,600 acres in the Willamette Valley of prime farmland. So my grandmother then was born into that family, and she went to college, and I think she actually graduated. And she came back home, and my grandfather by that time was working for her father on the farm. They met and fell in love. My grandmother, Zora, her father would not agree to the marriage, so they eloped. And they tell the story of they left one night and they were walking down the railroad train with their baggage, on the railroad tracks and their baggage in hand. And she was pretty much disinherited by her father for that act. She did inherit 30 or 40 acres when he died, but there was nothing she could do with it. They couldn't farm that small amount of land, and so she was forced to sell it to the brother who inherited the rest of the farm. I think probably the farm is still in the same family because the tradition was those families did not sell farmland that was prime farmland, unless there were no sons or daughters who wanted to carry it on. So, returning to my grandfather, I don't know, when they married, then I don't know what his first job was, but they ultimately, I know they lived in Ballston, Oregon for a while because that's where my mother was born. But I'm not sure what kind of jobs he had, probably doing farm work or maybe he's transporting some stuff. I think at one time he told me that he drove a stage over one of the passes in Central Oregon, transporting goods over the Oregon Pass. But anyway, they went into Portland, moved into Portland ultimately. They had 4 children, 3 girls, my mother, one of them of course, and 1 boy, Gene Armstrong. So in Portland, my grandfather worked in a dairy that I know of, doing physical labor, transporting, loading large barrels of milk onto carts or whatever to deliver the milk. And I'm not sure how long he worked there. I know that they took a trip to Montana where he worked in the coal mines for a while, but that didn't work out very well for them and they came back. My grandfather never had a really well-paying job. He ultimately got a farm with the help of his daughter Vera, my Aunt Vera, who was working for Montgomery Wards, and she had a fairly good job. So they bought a farm south of Portland, not a large farm, and they were trying to make a living there. 2 families living on the farm. We took many trips down there in the summertime because my brother Gene and I loved to go down to the farm and ride the horse that my cousin had, my cousin Gary Lord, and just do farm things. It was wonderful. But they just sort of eked out a living. They sold eggs and they grew produce and they sold that, and they had a few dairy cows and they sold milk, but it was a hand-to-mouth proposition for them. And ultimately, when my parents moved up into Washington, I guess I'll go back to their marriage. My mom had graduated from high school and was teaching PE in high school when she met my dad, and I think they met on a blind date. Dated for a while, and then they married. And my dad, that was the Depression time, and my dad had a job at a nursery, a garden place, a nursery garden, as a bookkeeper. But then they moved to Scappoose, and he worked there as a bookkeeper too for a while. I think my brother Gene, who's 2 years older than I am, was born in Scappoose. I'm not sure. Anyway, they moved up to Tacoma then because we were in the years just before World War II and the economy of the Northwest was really growing, and my dad got a job with a music store in Tacoma. So I was born in Tacoma. About that, shortly after my birth, I have no recollection of living in Tacoma at all. Shortly after my birth, the family moved to Bremerton area, because the shipyard was hiring a lot of guys to work on the Navy ships. And my dad got a job with a music store, Earl Brown's Music, in downtown Bremerton. The town was booming with all the people coming in to work in the Navy Yard. So it was a good time to move to Bremerton. I have no personal memory of this, but I know we lived in Tracyton on Waterfront when I was born. My dad and mom had to sell that property after the war started because gasoline was rationed and they couldn't get gasoline to drive back and forth to work, where my dad's worked, so they moved into Bremerton. My own recollections began really with the Bremerton time. I have a few memories of my mother when we were still living at Tracyton. She had some major back surgery, and at that time, if they did a disc removal or something, you were in a full body cast for 6 months and you couldn't get out of bed, so it was really a hard thing for the family. I spent time with my grandparents. We were still on the farm in Oregon during that time, and I have some recollections of walking with my grandfather out to the barn early in the morning to milk the cows. It was 5 o'clock in the morning or something, and I probably would have been 2 years old, 3 years old maybe, and I remember my grandfather, as we were walking out there, he had my hand, I was walking hand in hand, and he would be singing to me, Little David was small, but oh my, and he kept repeating that. Little David was small, but oh my. And that's my memory there. I also sort of remember they had a bunk for me in the kitchen, and I was sleeping on the kitchen bunk because the kitchen was the only room in the house that was heated after they went to bed. It was heated with the wood cook stove. There was no central furnace in the entire house. It was vacant, no heating source. There's also no indoor plumbing. They had an outdoor outhouse. But I have fond memories of that. I think I grew particularly close to my grandfather during that time. So now we're up to the move into Bremerton. We lived on Naval Avenue, near the Naval Avenue School, the old school. It was Naval Avenue. My brother Gene, 2 years older than I am, started school there, and I didn't start when we first moved in there. I was still at home most of the time, but then I ultimately started there. We lived there. There were two homes on the property. There was a large home right on the street and a smaller cabin in the back, and for a long time my grandparents lived in the one in the back. Then my dad and mom rented that out, and my grandparents moved into the big house with us. It was a pretty big house, lots of bedrooms. And so I started school at Naval Avenue. When I was in the 5th grade, my parents moved to another home on Olympic Avenue in Bremerton. And we lived there not for very long, a year or two, and I went through Kuntz High School, Kuntz Junior High, 7th grade, while we were still living there. Sometime about then, my mother with a friend went to Montana to open up a dance studio. My mother had become an Arthur Murray dance studio. She started out in Seattle and was commuting and did a lot of work until, I think the studio was open for teaching until 10 o'clock. So she would leave late in the afternoon or early in the afternoon and not get home until after midnight. So my grandparents really started taking care of me and my brother during that time. And I have nothing but fond memories about my grandmother. She was an old-fashioned farm cook. She baked bread. My grandfather said he couldn't eat store-bought bread. He was allergic to it. So we always had homemade bread, and I still love homemade bread. My grandfather, when he was younger, played baseball. I think the only sport in the United States in the late 1800s was baseball. And so the guys out in the farming area even would form teams and they would play each other. I have a wonderful picture of my grandfather in his baseball uniform, and he was kind of stretching to throw the ball, and he looks like a real athlete. He, of course, was incredibly strong during all the years that I knew him, from working with his hands and his body all those years, and spading the garden by hand, no rototillers or anything like that, pitching the hay by hand into the cart that was taking it to the barn. Everything was done by hand. Milking cows by hand. I think they ultimately got a cow milking machine, but for years and years it was milking cows by hand, so his hands were enormously strong. I remember we had a contest, my brother and I and my cousin Gary Lord, who was living with us at the time, about, my grandmother would can things, and so then she needed somebody to open the can, and she would give it to us first to try, and I couldn't do it, my brother couldn't do it, my cousin couldn't do it. My grandfather would pick it up with one hand and lock it on like a wrench of some kind and open it easily. So we've taken a brief break, and I'll continue on now with the story of when we moved on to Naval Avenue in Bremerton. I went through the 5th grade there. My brother was 2 years ahead of me. And then we moved to another home in Bremerton, and I went to Kuntz Junior High School for the 7th grade. And then my family moved out on the old Belfair Highway on, I think it was 3.5 acres, 2 homes on that place. My grandparents were still with me, and so they moved into the home and back, and we lived in the big house. I started at South Kitsap then and stayed there for the rest of my career, graduating in 1956. My brother graduated 2 years earlier, and he was at the University of Washington. My college career I've been to 3 colleges: Olympic College for 2 quarters, Reed College in Portland for a year, and then the University of Washington for the rest of the time. It took me about 5.5 years to get through college because I took a 6-month active duty in the Army assignment during that time. Anyway, then I went to law school in San Francisco at Hastings Law School, graduated in 1964. I practiced law in San Francisco for a little more than 2 years, and then I went to San Bernardino for a little more than 3 years. And then I moved back to Kitsap County, and I practiced law here until I retired from that and became a judge on the Washington State Court of Appeals. I'll continue on with my grandparents' story a little bit. They lived with us on the old Belfair Highway until we moved off that. My parents sold that after I graduated from high school. And so my grandparents moved back to the Portland area, and my dad bought a small home for them on the outskirts of Portland, where they lived until my grandmother died of a stroke, and my grandfather then moved back up here and stayed with my parents for a while, stayed with me for a while, and then ended up in a nursing home. I think he lived to be 94. My grandmother lived to be about 87. I was practicing law in Bremerton when I met Stephanie, my wife, and it was a sort of a blind date. A lawyer friend of mine had set us up, and it was a pretty good thing right from the beginning as far as I was concerned. Stephanie had contracted to go to Guam, I think, or one of those, I don't know where it was, somewhere over in Japan, near Japan, where we had troops, and she was going to teach in school over there. And so I proposed to her, shortly after we met, I think 6 weeks or 4 weeks after we met, and she canceled out on that and stayed here. And the rest of the story is Quincy's birth and Maggie's birth and our wonderful years of them growing up in high school here. Well, those are pretty funny stories. My mother was a party girl, I think. I know. And she loved to have cocktails in the afternoon. She was always out and about. My grandparents really spent most of the time raising me and my brother. My mother worked, as I've said, as an Arthur Murray dance studio teacher, and that took her to Seattle, and she'd get home late. And then, frequently she would invite friends who worked with her in the studio over to spend the weekend with us, and it would be one long party all weekend long. So my grandparents did the major teaching and guidance of me, at least during my young years. My grandfather bragged about being a socialist and that he had never voted for anybody other than Eugene V. Debs. He was very passionate about his beliefs. He was very critical of the economic system of the country and what he called the plutocrats, the very wealthy who were controlling everything. He was a strong union person, and he would start in on these lectures during the dinner time. My mother would typically be gone at dinner time. My dad would be there. My grandparents would have fixed the meal, and I was there. My brother was there, and from about my time as a sophomore in high school, my cousin Gary was there. And so my grandfather would get wound up in these discussions during the dinner table, and he would be increasingly agitated and speaking very loudly and pounding on the table. My father had very subtle beliefs and was a quiet sort of person, and I know those meals, as I think back on it, were very hard on him. He developed TMG symptoms at the time, and I didn't know what they were then, but I know during the meal his jaw would start cracking, popping when he was chewing, and that's a stress-related thing, I think. So, but my grandparents were wonderful caretakers of me and my brother and my cousin, and my dad was the mainstay kind of in financially supporting the family. And my mother was important, but she pretty much had her own program through most of my growing up years. So it was, we would go on camping trips, a few camping trips during the summertime. And my mother was not a camper, of course, but she and we had a friend from Long Beach, California, who came up one year, and we decided to go camping. So we had a tent and some sleeping bags and that kind of stuff, and So we were getting ready, and it took all morning to pack up the food and do all that kind of stuff, and we kids were ready to go. My mother and this couple that she knew from California started drinking beer about that time, and there was a Wigwam Tavern about a half mile from where we lived. So we got in the truck or the car or the van, whatever we had then, and started out to the state park where we were going to camp overnight. And we made the first stop a half mile away at the tavern, the Wigwam Tavern. My mom and her friends went inside the tavern and drank beer for, I don't know, an hour or two. We weren't upset about that. It was kind of not too unusual. And so then we went out to the campsite. My dad was working. He came out and joined us, but he stayed only for the meal, and then he went back home to sleep in his own bed. My dad was always in the music business. When the war started here, of course, we were flooded with workers and sailors. And one of the big things that sailors liked to do was when they got to leave on the weekend, they wanted to go meet women, and so they were looking for a dance. And my dad, had stayed in the music business all that time, and was a good piano player, and a good musician for big band style of music, a Glenn Miller style of music. And he made a deal with, it was either the Lions Club or the Eagles Club or something. They said, if you'll come and do the music, we'll put on a dance, and we have no idea how much money we'll make or whether it'll be a success at all. But our deal with you will be that you can have half of the proceeds, half of the profit from the dance. And so they did it, and the place was jam-packed with sailors, and other people too, of course, but it was mostly sailors. And so they made far more money than they expected. As soon as they were done counting the money, they gave my dad his half, which was something like, his share was like $1,500 after he'd paid the band's guys. And that was a huge amount of money then. And so, but the Eagles or else whatever it was decided, well, we'll just do this on our own and hire a band from now on. So they went out, they dropped out of the deal they'd made with my dad, and my dad then decided to do his own dance studio, and they did that. My parents did, off and on during the entire part of World War II. And they certainly didn't get wealthy like a lot of people. I know tavern owners in the Kitsap area made a lot of money during the war, but my dad made a very good income, and it was enough for him to start a music business when the war was over. So he was teaching piano lessons all the time, and then he started selling pianos, and he had Baldwin pianos, and when Baldwin came out with the organs, he got those too. But his business was always, he was the one guy who could make money at it. When we went on vacations, he would hire people to come in, and so he could keep the store open, but they never sold anything. My dad was the salesperson. He was a very gentle, kind person that people would respect, and he was a good musician, so he didn't, no high pressuring, but he had a good product with the Baldwin Piano Company, and he made a good living, paying for college for myself and my brother, and providing a good life for my mom. So my mother stopped teaching dance when she was, after she went to Montana that time. That was just before we moved out to the old Belfair Highway. But she did start teaching kids in junior high, and I think even high school. She started giving dance lessons for those. There'd be a whole crowd of people. In fact, Stephanie was one of the students who, when she did her dancing like at Kuntz High School, she'd go in and there'd be, I don't know, a couple hundred kids in there after school, right after school, and they were coming to learn the dance. The story that we tell often is that the principal of the school and somebody else, maybe it was the PE teacher, who told my mom when she came in that they would come in and help her with the discipline. And my mother said she didn't need that, and they didn't believe her, but she was absolutely true. She had a whistle always, and she had absolute control of both the boys and the girls. So I don't know where to go from there.
Your music lessons. How you got started?
Yeah, my dad or my mom, my brother and I took piano lessons. I think I was about 6, maybe 5 when we started, and it was with a local piano teacher in Broward that my dad knew, Mrs. Meldy. And we went there until I was about 14, I think. And then my dad decided that we needed to go to Seattle to see if we could find, a little more serious music teacher. The serious is not the right word, but to take a step up in terms of the quality of what we were learning. And so we went to Cornish School of Music at that time. It's now a college of arts and crafts and music. But then it was music. And Stephen Balog was I don't know whether he was the president, he was the head of the school, and he was a pianist. He was from Hungary. And he took us on as students, and we became part of his piano group. And we played things on the radio, the broadcast over the FM radio in Seattle. But he died of cancer, I think, in the third year that we were taking lessons from him. And I liked him a lot. He was an impressive guy, and he would joke with us, and we talked about different kinds of music. I remember after he left Cornish, he opened a studio in Bellevue, and so we went over there, and we got out there by bus, I think, but by the time the piano group was over with, this was the group over there, 6 or 8 of us there, and we were playing music together, and some of it was being broadcast over the FM station. But by that time, there were no more buses running back in to catch the ferry back to Bremerton. So Mr. Balog would drive us into Seattle from Bellevue and take us down to the ferry dock. I remember one time we were riding along, and we noticed that he didn't have a radio in his car, and so I said, or my brother asked him, I don't remember, why don't you have a radio in your car? You like music, you're a music teacher, and there's all kinds of good music on the radio. And his answer was that's my business, and I don't want this to be part of that business. I want to have time out from my business. This is my quiet time. So he was about 5'5", I think. And the first time we met him, he opened the door. My brother was 6 feet or more then, and I was 5'11". And my mother was with us, and she liked to tell this story. He looked up at us and said, "How's the weather up there?" Well, he kind of made an impression on us at that time. But he died of cancer, 3 years later, 2 years after we started with him, 2.5 years, I think. My highlight in piano playing was in the spring of 1956, my senior year at high school. I had been selected from a competition of different musicians, high school musicians, the previous summer to play with the Bremerton Symphony concerto. And I won the contest. There were about 3 winners, and we played at different times. And so I don't know how I settled on it, but I decided to play George Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F. And that was the year that Stephen Balog died, so I didn't have his help, but one of the senior students there, a guy who was maybe 5, 6, 7 years older than I helped me with it, and I would go to Seattle periodically and play the whole thing through. I would be playing the piano part, he'd be playing the orchestra part, and so that helped a lot, and it just worked out really well. I did that, I think that was in March or April of 1956. And I just found the other day, or Stephanie found some clippings from that time, and there's a review by the Bremerton Sun music critic that talked about the performance of the symphony and my performance doing the Gershwin piece. So that was the highlight. My brother and I had intended to go to Germany. That was Mr. Balog's recommendation, and take serious lessons in music, piano, at a European Music Academy. And we planned to do that the year after I graduated from high school. We had enlisted in a college or music school in Munich. But during that summer we were working at Boeing, my brother and I, and he decided that he didn't want to go. He wanted to go back to the University of Washington. So I said, well, I'll go anyway. And there was an older woman who was taking composing guidance from Stephen Balog, who was part of the music club there, and she learned about that, and she said, well, I'll go over with you. So Carol Ruppel was her name, and she was probably 30-something. So we together, rode the Greyhound across the country, got on a ship in New York a couple days later, went over to Europe and caught the train to Munich, and I spent 1 day or 2 days, I think, and I was terribly homesick and frightened, and I got on a plane and came home. So that was the end of that. But it's been a disappointment in my life, but the events leading up to where I am now would not have followed that same chain if I had stayed over there and spent a year, maybe even more, doing music, learning music. So.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Haselwood Armstrong. I grew up in Bremerton. My parents were Chuck Haselwood and Beverly Haselwood. They had a business in Bremerton that they ran for a long time. I'll start with my dad's heritage and my mom's heritage. First of all, my dad's heritage. He was born to a couple, Cora and Cliff Haselwood, in eastern Washington, in the Ellensburg area. Before that, his dad, Cliff, was from, I need to look that up because I don't have it memorized. He was my grandpa. Cliff was my grandpa, and his parents were Richard and Martha, and they moved to Bellingham in the 1900s, early 1900s, on a 10-acre poultry farm. They had previously been in Kentucky, and then they moved to Oklahoma. And from Oklahoma, they came to Bellingham. But my grandfather, my dad's dad, we called him Granddad, he did not like the weather in Bellingham. So he moved Cora and their firstborn child, Richard, to the Ellensburg area. And so that's how they got to Ellensburg, where he was a farmer. He didn't own his own farm. Grandpa, he farmed for other people for pay for a long time. And then after their oldest child had some mental issues, he got a job working as a ditch rider. And when I was a kid growing up, I had no idea what a ditch rider was. But in order to irrigate the farms in eastern Washington, they built canals of river water that came into the farmlands, and they were gated, and the ditch rider opened the gates at certain times for each of the farmers to water their crops. So that was the only steady job that I remember my Grandpa Haselwood ever having. What I do remember about my Grandpa Haselwood and his wife Cora was that they when they moved back to Bellingham after my dad and his sister Lillian graduated from high school, that he had this little farm with 17 Shetland ponies, and that's where my sisters and I would go visit in the summer. And we loved those Shetland ponies. We thought that was wonderful. My grandma and my grandpa didn't own the farm. My aunt Lillian and her husband, Bob Clinton at that time, they owned the farm, but my grandparents lived there and ran it for them, while my aunt and uncle ran their veterinary business in town. So I have many wonderful memories about spending 2 weeks at a time up in the Burlington area on this little farm with my grandma, where she taught me how to make homemade bread and taught us how to take the cream off the top of the milk and make butter. And but we didn't get to do that very often because you could sell the cream for a lot of money, and that's how she made her money, spending money, was selling milk and cream to the neighborhood. So butter was a rare occasion that we made butter. So my mom's family, my mom was adopted when she was 2 or 3 months old. She was born to a woman, Harriet Nichols, who was not married at the time, and in those days that was something that was very hushed and kept secret. So she was placed in an adoption agency in North Dakota, where her adopted parents adopted her at about, like I said, about 3 months old. What I know about her natural parents was when I was just before the 10th grade, my family took a trip back east, and then we drove back home and stopped in North Dakota, and one of my dad's friends had done some research on the adoption agency where my mom was had lived, and found out who her natural mother was and who her natural father was. And so we introduced ourselves to her mother, and that was very interesting and an emotional thing for my mom. And that lady's name was Harriet Nichols, and she had a little dress shop in downtown Stanley, North Dakota, and she had never married. My mom's natural father had married, and he had a farm down the road where Harriet told us we could go drive by, but nobody in her dad's family, my mom's dad's family, knew about my mom, so she asked us not to go to the door and introduce ourselves. And my dad's natural dad, his name was John Van Berkom, and he was from Holland and had several kids. And again, nobody knew about my mom, so my family followed Harriet's wishes, and we did not introduce ourselves. But the family that my mom was adopted into, they were from South Dakota, Aberdeen, South Dakota, and their names were Alma and Emil Bressler, and they had both been from South Dakota. And Emil was a plumber, and shortly after they were married, they moved to North Dakota to Fort Yates Indian Reservation, where my grandfather was a plumber for the Indian tribe there. And so my mom had stories to tell us about what it was like to grow up on an Indian reservation. But when the war hit, or a little bit pre-war, there was a big boom in Bremerton. You could get a good job, and so my grandfather and grandmother on my mom's side, with my mom and her older sister, who was also adopted, Betty, moved to Bremerton. Actually, they lived in Southworth, and my grandfather commuted and was a plumber in the shipyard, or a pipe fitter in the shipyard during the war. My grandmother, Alma, my mom's grandmother, she was a homemaker and quite a good cook, and a dressmaker. She sewed all of our clothes. There were 4 of us girls in the family, and she sewed all of our clothes until probably we were in high school. She had us to dinner 2 nights a week to her house when my dad would be working late. My mom and there were 3 of us girls at that time, would go to my grandmother's house in downtown Bremerton, and for every Tuesday and every Thursday. And there were 2 menus. One was chicken and dumplings, which my sisters and I loved, and the other was navy bean soup, which we weren't as fond of, that you put vinegar in it. But it was just how my grandma cooked. It was farm food, and it was really good food. But the fun thing for us was it always ended with wonderful pie. My grandma could really turn out a great pie, and we got to make the whipping cream. She would get out a pint of cream from the refrigerator, and she would stand us up on a chair by the sink and have a little bowl with high sides. I remember the rules. It had to be a little bowl with high sides and a hand beater, and you'd have to have it in the sink because it does splatter a little bit. And so, we followed her rules, stood on the stool, beat the whipping cream, licked the beaters, added the vanilla and the sugar, and dumped as much as we could on our piece of pie. So that always ended the dinner hour pleasantly. And my dad would usually show up in time for dinner. And then after dinner, we would always watch TV shows that my grandparents liked, and we would all sit in the living room together and watch them. And one was the Red Skelton Show. And all the adults thought he was terribly funny. I was about 5 or 6, and I couldn't see what was so funny. But we watched it anyway, and then we watched the lovely Lennon sisters on the Lawrence Welk Show, and everybody liked that. So I just remember watching those kinds of shows at my grandparents' house on a regular basis, really all my childhood. So we lived close to my mom's parents, those grandparents, Alma, and my dad called my grandfather Dutch. That's what he went by, but his real name was Emil. My older sister was quite close to that grandmother. She taught her how to sew and how to cook, and I really, when I went to the grandmother's house, instead of taking the sewing lessons and the cooking lessons, I made friends with the kids that lived in the neighborhood and played hopscotch, and we played tag in the road and played outside, basically, kicked the can, and my sister was learning to sew. And my younger sister at that time was quite a bit younger and stayed in the house with my mom. So then my dad's parents, my dad was Chuck Haselwood, and his parents, again, I told you, lived in down south, and then they moved to Ellensburg, and then they moved back to Bellingham in my lifetime, or Burlington, not Bellingham. But so every summer, my family would go up to the farm, just the kids. My mom and dad would take us up on one weekend, drop us off to spend time with Aunt Lillian and Uncle Bob and their two kids, Sharon and Alan, and my Haselwood grandparents. And so we would spend some of the time in town, where my Aunt Lillian would take us to swim at different beaches, Samish Island, and that we loved, with the neighborhood friends in town. And then she would drop us off for a day or two at a time to stay with the grandma and grandpa out at the farm where the Shetland ponies were. And I can remember my older sister Camille being fascinated with the Shetland ponies. She had more of the animal gene than I had. I was more interested in grandma's dolls and those kinds of things. But Aunt Lillian gave us really stern directions that we could watch the ponies, but the younger ponies were just yearlings, and we really didn't pay too much attention to what that meant, but that they weren't ready to ride, so that we should not get on them. So I can remember my sister and I standing outside the fence, and my sister looking at me and she said, "I think I can ride that one." And over the fence she goes, on the back of the yearling pony, and off she goes in about a half a second on her tailbone on the ground. But fortunately it didn't break or anything, and she could get up, but she was walking kind of funny when Aunt Lillian came to pick us up. And so the story did leak out about what Camille had done, but I wasn't as interested in the horses at that time in my life as she was, or the ponies, but I thought that they were fun. And it was certainly a lot of fun to be with our grandparents. And I'm thinking back to the kind of house that farmhouse was. There was only one little heater, I think it must have been an oil heater, in the living room area, and then above that in the ceiling floor there was a little vent, so sometimes the heat would get up to the upstairs where the bedrooms were, where my sisters and I slept when we stayed there. But they had linoleum floors upstairs with no carpets, so I can remember getting out of bed there and the floor was very, very cold, but we still loved to go there. And all of the beds were covered with chenille bedspreads, and even to this day, I'll never forget that. They were warm and fuzzy and cozy. And the beds didn't have mattresses on them that were very thick. They were maybe a couple inches thick, but they were on springs like cots, so there weren't two mattresses. And so when you'd get in and out of bed, there was a lot of noise. And that was a lot of fun. So my grandmother Haselwood, her name was Cora, loved to garden, and it was a simple garden, but the two flowers that she liked the most were lavender and then zinnias. And so before we would come, she would take lavender and snip it and put it inside the pillows. So when we went to bed, we would smell the lavender, and that was really a memory I have. And in her later years, when we were in high school and she was no longer traveling to see us, or we weren't traveling to see her as often, when it was our birthday, she would send us nylon stockings with lavender sprinkled on them. And my older sister and I thought that was really special. Open the package and lavender falls out. So to this day, I love lavender. It's just a part of my heritage. So my parents met after the war. After World War II, my dad had come from Ellensburg and moved to Bremerton. He'd love to come to the west side of the mountains. Even when he was quite young, he would hop the train in a boxcar and come over and spend the weekend in Seattle with some friends and try to get to see a Husky football game even when he was quite young. And so he knew about Bremerton. So after the war, he came to Bremerton and worked in a gas station. And he met and married my mom. My dad stayed working in the gas station for probably maybe until I was born. And then he decided that really wasn't for him and he was going to be an electrician. So we moved to Richland with my mom's parents. And there were just 2 kids at that time, my older sister Camille and me. And well, my dad went to electrician school. And I'm not even sure he finished the program before he decided he wasn't going to be an electrician. So back we came to Bremerton. He went back to working at the gas station. It was on 6th and Park. It was called Speeds. And it was a big Mexican-style mobile gas station with a flying horse. So it was probably the biggest gas station in town. But one of his friends said to him, can I leave my car? I want to sell this car. Can I leave my car parked right out here with a sign on it about how much money, or that it's for sale? And will you sell it for me? And my dad had answered, as I remember the story anyway, well, I'll have to ask my boss. And if that's okay, yeah, I'll sell it for you in between, pumping gas. And so he did that, and when the car said, or the fellow who owned the car said, this is how much money I want for it, whatever you get over that, you can keep yourself. So, or split it with the owner of the gas station. I'm not exactly sure how that part went. But the bottom line of this story was that my dad made more money off of selling that one car than he did for 2 weeks working pumping gas. So at that point he decided he was in the wrong business and that he needed to be selling cars. So the history of his developing as a car salesman and a used car dealer and a car dealer, it is a long story, and it's probably, over the course of 50 years, it developed from selling that one car into quite multiple car businesses. So that was fun to watch that grow. We were always very proud of Dad for how hard he worked, but which meant that we saw much, much less of him than we might have been if he wasn't so dedicated to working. But he did grow a quite successful business. My mom was a homemaker. By the time she had my older sister when she was about 19, me when she was about 20. The third daughter was 5 years younger than me, and the fourth daughter was 11 years younger than me. So there were little children in my household for quite a long time. When I was growing up, I thought that the way we lived, with always being with my grandparents, every single holiday, my mom's sister and her family would come. The holiday dinners were always at our house, and they were always a lot of fun. Every holiday dinner, my mom did most of the cooking, my dad did the turkey, and my Aunt Betty would come with her harmonica and her family, and the sweet potatoes with the flaming marshmallows on top. And when she walked in the door, the fun began, because she started singing and playing the harmonica, and my dad also played the harmonica, and they would do duets, and we would sing along with them. And then after dinner, and dinner was all cleaned up, the whole family played charades. And when I was really little, the kids only watched, but as we got more grown up, the kids participated in that too, and wonderful bonding memories. So that's really the basics of my growing up years, except for one of the things that we did is when I was probably in about the 3rd grade, my mom and dad's business, the car business, was starting to do okay. And so they bought a lake place at Benson Lake, which is about a 45-minute drive from Bremerton. And in the summers, We would spend a lot of time there. My dad built our little house. It was a cabin. And my aunt and uncle bought the property next door. And my mom's best friend and her husband had a lake place at one end of the lake. And then some of my dad's former business partners had lake cabins up the lake. So there were a lot of people that my parents knew and really spent a lot of time with. And then a lot of kids to play with when we were at the lake. And I remember my cousins would come. They were 2 boys, Steve and Ted, and my dad had built a raft, and we played King of the Raft. And our boy cousins were a little bit older than us and a whole lot rougher and stronger. So I don't ever remember winning King of the Raft, but we played anyway. It was still a lot of fun. And in those years, my older sister and I were on a swim team, and so when we were spending the summers at the lake, we would swim across the lake in the morning before my dad went into work. He would take a rowboat and row beside us as we swam over across the lake and back, which was about, probably back and forth was about 2/3 of a mile, probably 1/3 of a mile across the lake. Maybe not quite that, I might be exaggerating, I'm not really sure. We should test that out and then I'll know for sure. But it was a long ways to swim, and it really did develop our swimming. So having a lake place was a wonderful way to grow up too, but it never was a water ski lake. It wasn't, you couldn't go that fast on it. But we did try to build the water skis with planks and flip-flops, nailing the flip-flops on and going behind a boat with that. But yeah, we weren't very successful, nor were we very good, but we had a lot of fun. So, when I met and married my husband, David, I had graduated already from the University of Washington. I had spent 1 year teaching in Central Kitsap, 7th and 8th grade English, and I found that when I was just barely 22, and I was teaching 8th graders that there wasn't really enough age separate. I really didn't know how to handle them socially, and it was really a hard job for me. So after 1 year, I decided you have to be more mature to have this job than I am. So I took my bicycle and I moved to Hawaii, and I thought that maybe being a waitress was going to be a kind of a lark, just a little fun job. And I decided that being a waitress in a fast-paced hotel was a pretty hard job too. So that only lasted a year too. And I decided, well, I'll go back to teaching. And I got a job working for the Department of Defense as a teacher for the Okinawa schools on the base in Okinawa. And my mom had recently died, and so I came to spend the summer with my dad back in Bremerton. And one of my dad's friends said, I don't think you should go to Okinawa, so I'm going to make sure you don't. And his name was Leonard Cruzy. And he said, I know 3 young attorneys in town that I can set you up with, and I'll start with the best. Well, he did that, and he set my date up with David Armstrong, who by the end of that summer, by September 1st, we were married. And that started my family life in Bremerton, my own family, where Quincy met and married Chrissy Harding, who had also graduated from the University of Washington. And they have given us 2 wonderful grandchildren, Natalie and Pierce. And Maggie married Ben White, who was getting his master's degree at Gonzaga just after Maggie completed hers. And they have 3 wonderful grandchildren, Nathan, Noah, and Annie. And some of the best times we have today are when we all gather in some resort sort of community and enjoy each other and whatever's available in that community to do for fun. So, questions? How am I doing?
Great. Can you talk about your father in the military or in the war, or any other family members that were in the military?
So my mom's adopted dad, Emil, was in the First World War. And he then, when I was growing up and my sisters were growing up, he was part of the VFW. I don't know any of his war stories. I do have a picture of him in his uniform. But he kept in touch with the local chapter of the VFW as long as he was alive. That was a mainstay in his life. My dad was called up in the draft during the Second World War, and he, I can't remember the name of the fort where he did his basic training here stateside, but he was shipped out to northern Italy, and he was under Patton towards the end of the war. He was in the reconnaissance division. I know that then when the war was winding down, he spent a lot of time in Austria and Germany. And then when he was sent home from that, and he was going to be sent to the Pacific, but then the war was over before it was his time to go. One of the things that he always told us about the military wasn't about the fighting or the war, but how he enjoyed other sailors and the townspeople, the places that where he was, and he loved to gamble and he loved to play cards. And he said they would take those green army blankets and throw it over a table anywhere they were, and they would play poker, and they played poker for money, and he loved to gamble. And then it developed from that into shooting craps. And he loved to do that, and his whole life he loved to play cards and to gamble. But when he got quite old, and because of his health, he had to stop smoking and drinking. And he told me at that time that gambling really wasn't fun unless you were smoking and drinking. So he wasn't as interested in gambling in that way, in gambling with cards and shooting craps and playing with dice. But he did gamble in his business. I think that was one of the reasons why he was successful. Some of it was the times. It was easier to build a business, he always said, in the time that he was trying to do it, but that he wasn't afraid to make a mistake. He was a big gamble. He said, well, I came into this life with nothing, and I don't mind if I leave it with nothing. This is a game for me. I love playing, and I'm going to take some chances. My mom wasn't so good at the gambling piece, and always wanted a safety net. So the stories that I learned from my dad about the war were mostly about gambling. I do remember, though, that when we were growing up, we were always told, don't wake your dad up when he's sleeping, let him wake up by himself. Because if you woke him up and he was startled, he would go back to being in the war in the foxhole and be ready to fight. So even then, PTSD, or it was a big thing, you just don't get over it, but you don't talk about it. I mean, he didn't talk about it, but we just knew that about him, that he would be ready. But I think over my dad's life, his closest friends were the kids that he played sports with and went to school with in Eastern Washington. And he stayed in contact with them really all his life. Even after my mom died, after some of them died, he couldn't remember his way around a lot of places close, but he could always remember how to get in the car and drive to Eastern Washington, drive to Ellensburg, and look up his old friends. And in his later years, he loved doing that. He'd tell stories about, when his parents would move from place to place when he was in high school, that he didn't want to keep moving, because that meant going from the high school that he was in back to the town high school in Ellensburg, and then back out of town to Kittitas County High School. And so he wanted to stay at Kittitas, and so he lived with a woman and milked cows for her before he went to school, so that he could to earn his stay and his food. And he stayed in the same high school from 9th grade through high school, where my aunt stayed in town and graduated from Ellensburg High School with my parents, and she did her whole 4 years at the same high school that way too. When my dad grew up in Eastern Washington and went to the high school that he went to, it wasn't a very big high school. And so when he was a freshman in high school, there was one football team, and he got to be on that football team. I don't know, maybe there were 30 or 40 kids in the whole school turning out for football, so he got to be the quarterback his whole 4 years. And I have a picture of him in his old little leather helmet. And so it was a whole different system than what goes on for kids today. I don't remember him ever talking about playing basketball, but he loved baseball, and he was the catcher. And my dad was a prankster. He loved to, he loved to tell stories about when he was squatting catching, that he was always going to tell the batter that he was going to grab that bat when he swung back, and he was going to make him stumble and fall, and just heckling the batter. I'm not sure he ever got caught, or maybe he got caught and just didn't tell, but he loved playing baseball, and so I remember he was always the one to teach us kids how to ride bicycles, or how he built stilts for us to walk up and down the sidewalks, from the street to the sidewalk when we were young, and that sort of thing. He was an athlete. But when I was about maybe 4, my dad contracted polio. Forgotten that. That was huge. And it was on his one side, I think it was his left side. And because he was full grown, it stripped the muscles all down his left side, but he had full height already, so it wasn't the same thing for him at his age as it might have been if he were 2 or 3, where he was still developing. So although he always had a limp after that, if you weren't really looking and watching, you might not know that. So, and really, I don't remember when I was growing up that they knew exactly what caused polio, but my mom would always tell us, if there's ever a fly anywhere, don't touch it, because flies carry polio. I'm sure that that's not the thought today, but there were never any flies in our house, because if there was, they got rid of the flies, and you were not allowed to touch the fly swatter, the part of it, because that's where all the polio germs were, from the squished flies. So my dad spent, I don't know how many days in the hospital, but it was quite serious, and when he came home, he was bedridden for quite a while, was in a wheelchair for quite a while, then graduated to a cane. One day he threw the cane away and said, I'm done with that. Had gone to a chiropractor, which some people believe in and some people don't, but it made my dad a believer in chiropractors, because the chiropractor did something and said, I don't think you're going to need the cane. It didn't make my dad's muscles in the back of his calf or his thigh return, but I don't know what it did. It maybe just gave him confidence, and he walked just fine after that. My mom, what she loved to do, was her favorite thing to do was to dance. She loved any kind of dancing, and when she was in high school in Bremerton, after they had moved from North Dakota, there was a big dance hall in Bremerton called Pearl Mowers, and on Friday nights it was for young people, and they had young people's dancing, and Saturday nights it was for the older set, and there was the Glenn Miller style dance band music. I think I'm right on that, but maybe I have that a little bit off, but my mom loved to go to that, and she knew how to jitterbug, and she just thought that was the living in. She also was a little bit musical, and in high school she played piccolo. And so when my sisters and I were taking piano lessons, my mom would pretend that she didn't have a piccolo at our house, but she pretended that she was playing the piccolo along with us, and that was always a lot of fun. But so it was my mom's idea that we take music lessons, that all my sisters and I played the piano, and it was her idea that we all took dancing lessons, all of us took dancing lessons, and my older sister was always thought of as the ballet dancer, and I was maybe more thought of as the cowgirl. And I can remember, it's interesting what you remember from your childhood, but my dad, when he was starting his car business, he would make long trips on Tuesday to Portland, to the car auction, to take cars that weren't selling, to sell them at the auction, and to buy cars that he thought our community would want to buy. And so he left early in the morning and didn't come back until late at night, but he always got us up and read us a story when he got home. And one time he brought us watches home, and we had learned to tell time, and that was a big thing. And so we got watches, and my sister got a Cinderella watch. It had a beautiful pink band, beautiful Cinderella on it, and I got Gene Autry. And to this day, I'm still a little mad that I got Gene Autry. At least I could have gotten Annie Oakley or something, but Gene Autry, I didn't even know who Gene Autry was. But I was the cowgirl, I guess. So, parents do typecast their kids. And kids are each different too, and you might deserve the casting that you get, but everybody would want the princess watch. No girl would want geometry watch, so, but my dad didn't know that. I don't have any more war stories that I can think of right now. I can remember being at the lake a lot in the summers in my growing up years, and my mom, and by that time there were four girls. We would stay at the lake, and my dad would commute, and that was really just a tremendous amount of fun and camaraderie, and with the other kids on the lake. And so when David and I were raising our kids, when the time came that we could have a lake place, we did. And I remember that as an equal amount of fun. It was a little more upscale, not the cabin wasn't, but the boating certainly was, and the skis were a huge improvement. Our kids had real skis, and became quite the skiers. And both David and I enjoyed skiing too. And I do remember too at the lake, when in the summer when it was my birthday, everybody would say, what do you want to do for your birthday? And I frequently would say, go to the lake and spend the day at the lake, and maybe buy some frozen lobster and have a lobster dinner or something that we cook ourselves. But when we got to the lake, it was just as easy at the lake for everybody to kind of go their different directions as it was at home. So then I got a little more specific. I wanted to spend the day at the lake on the boat so that I had everybody captive. And we did that many times, and that was really a lot of fun for me. They couldn't get away from me. They had to visit with me all day long. That was the best birthday.